moves forward. Always forward. But what if it didn't? What if the fabric of reality could bend, twist, and tear, allowing ordinary people to slip through cracks in eternity itself? I'm talking about time travel. Not the Hollywood kind with fancy machines and dramatic countdowns. I'm talking about ordinary people who just slipped through the cracks of existence itself. People who went to sleep in one century and woke up in another. People who stepped out for a walk and ended up God knows where or when. Tonight, we are delving into 3 incredible, true, and mysterious stories of time travelers. Stories of Paul Amadeus Dienach, a teacher who claimed to live an entire year in the distant future. Rudolph Fentz, a Victorian gentleman who stepped out of the past into Times Square, and the man from Taured, the impossible traveler. Each of these travelers had their story to tell in their time zones. Prepare to have your mind completely blown, because after tonight, you'll never look at time the same way again. Where are you watching from today? Do you mind sharing a mystery that happened in your location? I'll be going through the comments. Your story might be featured in our next video. Our story begins in 1921. In a modest apartment in Zurich, a Swiss-Austrian teacher named Paul Amadeus Dienach closed his eyes for what he thought would be a brief rest. He was 37 years old, plagued by poor health, and exhausted from his work. But when he opened his eyes again, everything had changed. Not just the room, not just the day. It was the entire world. Dienach had fallen into a coma, a deep, impenetrable sleep that lasted an entire year. But according to his own account, his mind and his consciousness had traveled somewhere else entirely. Somewhere impossible. He traveled to the year 3906. Picture this. You close your eyes in 1921, and when you open them, you're standing in a world nearly 2,000 years in the future. The person staring back at you in the mirror isn't you, it's Andreas Northam, a man whose body you now inhabit. And around you stretches a civilization so advanced and so peaceful that it seems like paradise itself. This is what Dienach claimed happened to him. For what felt like an entire year, he lived as Andreas Northam, walking through cities that gleamed like jewels, speaking with people who had transcended war, poverty, and hatred. He witnessed a world where nations no longer existed, where humanity had united under a single, enlightened government, where technology served not to divide, but to heal both the planet and the human spirit. But here's where the story becomes even stranger. When Dienach finally awakened from his coma in 1922, he was a changed man. His eyes held secrets and his hands trembled as he reached for paper and pen. And then, he began to write. Page after page. Day after day. Month after month. He documented everything. Every conversation with the people of 3906. Every marvel he had witnessed. Every detail of humanity's distant future. The diary grew thick with his cramped, urgent handwriting, as if he feared the memories would fade before he could capture them all. But Dienach was no fool. He knew what people would think. He knew they would call him mad, and a delusional man driven insane by his illness. So he kept his secret. He bound it in leather and locked it away. Before he died in 1924, just 3 years after his extraordinary experience, Dienach entrusted his diary to his favorite student, a young Greek law student named George Papahatsis. He asked him to keep it safe, and he should only read it years after he is gone. Papahatsis agreed, not knowing he held in his hands what would become known as the Chronicles from the future. For over a decade, the diary gathered dust. Papahatsis, now a successful lawyer, occasionally glanced at the cryptic German text, but the writing was so dense and so peculiar that he couldn't make sense of it. The script seemed almost otherworldly, as if written by someone struggling to translate experiences that had no earthly equivalent. Then, in the 1930s, curiosity finally won. Papahatsis began the painstaking process of translation, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. Dienach's vision of 3906 was not just remarkable, it was prophetic. He described a world that had survived what he called the Great Catastrophe of the 23rd century. Environmental collapse, wars that nearly destroyed civilization, and a period of darkness so complete that humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. But from that darkness came light. The future humans Dienach encountered were not the same species that walked the earth in 1921. They had evolved not just physically, but spiritually as well. They were, in his words, carefree children, unburdened by worries or fears. They had learned to harness energy without destroying their planet. They had discovered the secret of living in harmony with nature, with each other, and with the cosmos itself. Most remarkably, they had conquered death itself, not through technology, but through understanding. They knew that consciousness, the very essence of what makes us human, could transcend the physical body. Here was proof that humanity wouldn't destroy itself, that we'd learn to do better, that love would eventually win. But it also raised the question that haunts me to this day. If Paul really did see the future, what does that mean for us? Are we living in his past right now, stumbling toward that beautiful destiny he described? Or are we just the dreams of a dying man who couldn't bear to believe that all this pain and chaos, was all there was? Was he crazy? Was he a prophet? Or was he just lucky enough to slip through a crack in time itself? The question haunts us still. Because if Dienach truly did glimpse our future, what does that mean for the present we live in today? Our next story is one of shock and an unbelievable incident. Times Square, 1950. The heart of modern New York City pulsed with neon lights and an endless stream of yellow taxis. It was a warm June evening, and the streets were alive with the energy of a city that never sleeps. Then, without warning, chaos erupted. A man stepped directly into the path of an oncoming taxi, and there came the screech of brakes and the sickening thud of impact. And then, silence. Police officer Hubert Risley rushed to the scene, expecting to find just another tragic accident in a city full of them. But what he discovers will haunt him for the rest of his career. The victim lay motionless on the asphalt. The victim wasn't just dead, he was impossible. He dressed like a character from a Victorian novel, a long frock coat, old-fashioned breeches, and buckled shoes that belong in a museum. His beard is perfectly groomed in a style that hasn't been fashionable for 70 years. Risley knelt beside the body, and his hands shook visibly as he searched the body. What he found made his blood run cold. An uncirculated 1876 penny, bright and new as if it had just been minted. Business cards for companies that vanished decades ago. A bill for horse stable cleaning, dated 1876. And most disturbing of all, a letter addressed to someone on Fifth Avenue, written in the elegant script of the previous century. The man's name, according to his identification, was Rudolph Fentz. Risley's investigation began immediately. He contacted the address on the letter, which was a building that still stands on Fifth Avenue. An elderly woman answered the door, and her eyes widened in recognition when she heard the name. "Rudolph Fentz?" she whispered. That was my great-grandfather. But he disappeared when I was just a child. My grandmother told me stories. He went out for a walk one evening in 1876 and never came home. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but they formed a picture that made no sense. According to the woman's family records, Rudolph Fentz was 29 years old when he vanished without a trace in 1876. He left behind a young wife, a thriving business, and a mystery that his family had never been able to solve. Now, 74 years later, a man matching his exact description, wearing the same style of clothing, carrying the same belongings, had materialized in Times Square. He appeared to be the same age as if not a single day had passed. But how? The story even includes details of an alleged autopsy, which supposedly revealed no signs of disease or aging typical of someone from the 19th century. His lungs were clean, his teeth perfect, and his skin was unmarked by the harsh realities of 19th century life. It was as if he had been frozen in time, preserved like a fly in amber, only to be released into a world he could never understand. The taxi driver, still shaken from the accident, gave a statement that chilled investigating officers to the bone. "He just appeared," the driver insisted. "One second the street was empty, the next second he was there. He looked around like he'd never seen a car before. Like he was confused, terrified. He started walking toward me, and I couldn't stop in time." But the most disturbing aspect of the case came from witness accounts. Several people reported seeing the man standing on the corner for several minutes before the accident, looking around in obvious bewilderment. He seemed to be studying the electric signs, the automobiles, and the modern dress of the people around him. One witness, a newspaper vendor, claimed the man approached him and asked, "Where are the horses?" Another reported that he seemed to be searching for something or someone. He kept checking a pocket watch as if he had an appointment to keep. The official explanation was simple: he was a mistaken identity. Surely this was just a man with an eccentric taste in clothing who happened to share a name with someone from the past. But that explanation couldn't account for the uncirculated 1876 penny, or the business cards from companies that had been defunct for decades, or the family records that matched perfectly with a man who had vanished without a trace. The case was quietly closed and filed away in the archives of the New York Police Department. But the questions remained. What if time isn't as fixed as we think? What if there are cracks in reality that ordinary people can stumble through? What if Rudolph Fentz took a single step in 1876 and emerged, terrified and unchanged, into a world that had moved on without him? Rudolph was an ordinary man who just wanted to take a walk and ended up lost in time. Did he understand what had happened to him in those final moments? Did he realize he'd traveled through time itself? Or was he just confused and scared, wondering why the world had gone insane? Our last story is about the impossible traveler from a world that never existed. In July 1954 at Haneda Airport, Tokyo, the morning sun streamed through the terminal windows as passengers from around the world queued at customs. It was a routine day until customs officer Sato encountered a passenger who shouldn't exist. The man appeared normal at first glance. He was well-dressed and polite, and he carried a leather briefcase. He spoke fluent Japanese, which is unusual for a European, but not impossible. What was impossible was the document he presented. A passport from the country of Taured. Sato stared at the document as his trained eye examined every detail. The passport appeared genuine, it was of high-quality paper, and had official seals and stamps from various countries. But there was a problem. A big problem. Taured doesn't exist. Sato approached the traveler with careful formality, speaking in Japanese as he inquired about the passport's place of issue. The man's expression transformed from polite patience to bewilderment as he explained that the document had been issued in Taured, his homeland. When Sato informed him that no such country existed, the traveler's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. The man insisted that Taured had existed for over 1,000 years, positioned between France and Spain in the Pyrenees. His certainty prompted Sato to summon his supervisor, then another official. Soon, a small crowd of airport personnel had assembled, all fixated on the impossible passport that defied their understanding of world geography. The officials produced detailed, official maps of Europe for examination. The travelers studied them with mounting alarm and distress. He protested that the maps were incorrect, demanding to know where Taured had gone. According to his understanding, it should have been visible between France and Spain, with extensive borders touching both nations. He spoke of trade relationships and multiple visits to the region. The customs officials found themselves in an unprecedented situation. The man's distress appeared authentic rather than deceptive, and his confusion seemed too genuine to be an elaborate ruse. They exchanged uncertain glances, faced with a mystery that challenged their basic understanding of reality. They further examined his belongings more carefully. His briefcase contained currency from several European countries, including some bills they didn't recognize. His business cards list him as a representative of a company that, according to their records, doesn't exist. Most disturbing of all, his passport contained stamps from countries around the world, stamps that appeared genuine, but some were from locations that didn't match any known geography. The supervisors spoke gently, explaining that they needed to detain him until they could verify his identity. The man nodded in response, though his face had gone pale with confusion and distress. He struggled to comprehend what was happening, explaining that he had made this same trip dozens of times before. He mentioned his hotel reservation and scheduled business meetings, unable to grasp how the authorities could claim his country doesn't exist. They escorted him to a nearby hotel, booked him a room on the 3rd floor, and 2 officers were stationed outside his door, not as punishment, but as protection. The man seemed lost and frightened. He looked like a child who had suddenly found himself in a world he didn't recognize. The investigation began immediately. The officials contacted embassies, consulted with geographical experts, and searched through every historical record they could find. They discovered references to ancient regions with similar names, but nothing that matched the man's description of Taured. The man's hotel room was directly above the immigration office. The windows were sealed, and the only exit was past the guards. It was impossible to leave undetected, but the impossible has already happened once that day. The next morning, the guards knocked on the door for the usual check-in. No answer. They knocked again and called out, yet no answer. Then they finally used their key to open the door. The room was empty. Not just empty, spotless. The bed was made like housekeeping had just finished. There were no personal belongings and no signs that anyone had ever been there. The man from Taured had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed at all. Airport security reviewed every camera, checked every exit, and even questioned every employee. But no one saw him leave, and no one remembered seeing him at all, except for the officials who dealt with him directly. The passport, the business cards, and the foreign currency had all disappeared with him. The only evidence that the man from Taured ever existed is the testimony of the customs officials who encountered him. And even they began to doubt their own memories as the days passed. Was he a traveler from a parallel universe, a world where geography had developed differently? Had he somehow slipped through a dimensional barrier, only to be pulled back when reality corrected itself? The case remains open in the files of the Japanese Immigration Bureau. But the questions it raises go far beyond simple bureaucratic confusion. These 3 stories remind us that time is not rigid. These men didn't choose their journeys. They were just people. Regular, everyday people living regular, everyday lives until something extraordinary ripped them out of their normal existence and thrust them into situations that defied all logic. Paul Amadeus Dienach was a tired teacher who took a nap and woke up in paradise. Rudolph Fentz was a businessman who went for a walk and ended up lost in time. The man from Taured was a traveler who showed up at the wrong airport in the wrong reality. But here's the most unsettling thought of all. If these stories are true, if time and reality can bend and break in ways we don't understand, then it could happen to anyone. It could happen to you. The next time you step out for a walk, the next time you close your eyes for a brief rest, the next time you present your passport at an airport, you might find yourself somewhere or someone else entirely. The boundaries between past, present, and future might be more fragile than we dare to imagine. And somewhere, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the impossible waits. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the impossible. If these stories have left you questioning the nature of reality itself, then our mission is complete. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Until next time, keep questioning everything.